were around, right? She looks at me. She says birth control made him do it.
Grandma is probably right. There were many things that affected society in the 60s, in the mid 60s, and early 70s. And if you ask different categories of people, they're going to give you very different explanations. If you ask people who are interested in the economy, they'll say, or Bitcoin, they'll say that it was the gold switch when gold was no longer attached to the dollar. And if you ask conservatives, especially intellectual conservatives, they'll say that it's when welfare increased, and then they'll further argue that that caused the demise of the black family, and a few decades later, the demise of the white family. Um, if you ask anti-feminists, they will tell you that it was caused by feminism and the sexual revolution, and just the increase of women in the workforce. And all of those factors might play some level of role, but I think Grandma's right. And the main factor is actually not only in divorce rates, but in all those other characteristics of society that became worse since the 70s. They were caused by birth control. And now, let me just state that outright. I think birth control was a good thing. I think birth control is a from an ethical standpoint, I think it's a positive. I think it would be bad to have a society where people are just having births that they don't want to have. In general, I'm in favor of freedom and consent, so I'm in favor of people only being subject to things that they consented to do. And if you consented to sex, you didn't consent to babies. Obviously the conservatives will say that are completely wrong. Those things are completely separate, and evolution made us interested in them in separate ways. So there are people who are interested in sex without being interested in babies, and vice versa. But the main thing that happened, and I think people don't really realize how much tracks down to biology, and how a lot of the differences in behavior and the changes in society, they're changes in people's biology. You can argue that when you see like different demographics behaving in different ways, because they evolved in different places, having different tolerance to um, different societal behaviors, different diets, different ways of being, and so on. And likewise, like most characteristics turn out to be heritable. The more we study, the more interesting psychological characteristics, like personality is very heritable. It's like maybe 50 something like that percent. Intelligence is even more, could be up to like 80. Autism and schizophrenia are the two highest ones, so it's like 80 or more. And so biology is very significant. And people don't consider that when we introduced the birth control pill and it became widespread, available, which was 1965-ish, that didn't just change people's like specific immediate sexual behavior, but it also changed the biochemistry, right? So the biochemistry of a person determines how they behave to a great extent. If you ever had a psychedelic, if you ever been on ADHD drugs, or if you ever been in in the aftermath of an anesthesia, you will remember that like it was very different from being you, right? Like it just doesn't feel the same to be biochemically modified. And basically, like by changing a person's biochemistry, you can change their minds in a very drastic way. And the birth control pill doesn't change only women's ability to conceive, but it also changes how their biochemistry works and operates, and that changes how their brain is working. So you could argue, in theory, that you basically introduced a new kind of species, mentally speaking, into our species. And the changes in behavior of that new species that was introduced, which is basically the people who are XX plus whatever biochemical changes in the brain and in mentality the birth control pill induces, the introduction of this new species has been the biggest biological change in arguably the history of our species or something like that. So like it's obvious that if you introduce like hundreds of millions of new people who will behave in a different way, who have a different personality, who have a different way of thinking, and they will also have a different way of voting, they'll have a different way of behaving, and they will completely like overhaul and change the way society works. So yes, it's true that we got richer, that industrialization, that liberation for work, and maybe the gold attachment and the central banks and whatever, like all these other things that happened, in 1971 or a little bit before, they all had some effect, and the civil rights and the children of the African American diaspora being born, like all those things had effects. And some of those effects might even be big. But I do think that when it comes to the thick of it, if you had to select, like, what was one variable that most changed the way society works, that changed, and that we're still living in the aftermath of, I would pick the birth control pill. And the other thing, historically, culturally, that we are still living in the aftermath of is the Second World War. So I would say that, if you had to explain the history of the last 150 years or so, but you were only allowed to talk about two factors, right? Doing something that we call principal component analysis um, in many fields of science. I would argue that the two main events of the last 150 years, from a cultural standpoint and from a biological standpoint and from a behavioral standpoint, that most changed society were the Second World War, because a lot of the culture that came after it was basically in reaction to it. And to this day, um, a lot of what we praise is basically like take whatever the Nazis did, invert it, and that is like what you should consider morally good. Um, this is more true on the left side of politics, but even on the right, there is some of that. So, our morality, our moral arc, and our historical narrative is still a historical narrative where what we're doing is kind of reacting to the Second World War and reacting to the excesses and the problems caused by the Nazis. And then on a biochemical level, I think that the other thing that most changed our society was the introduction of the birth control pill and the enormous changes in behavior, in voting patterns, in family structure, in who does or doesn't give birth to children, um, and so on that happen after that. And our brains are not evolved to deal with that. Like our brains are not adapted to that idea. That's why so many profitable businesses are selling like the something that is a cloud of probability that seems like sexual access and that seems like access to having a baby, but actually that they won't provide you with either sex or a baby, because now people can just take a birth control pill or use some other contraceptive method, and those contraceptive methods, they will not cause the evolutionary consequence of old. In one sense, this is very good because it means that we are one of the very few generations where we can get the pleasure, the pleasure centers that evolution triggered in our brains by having sex without getting the potentially damaging consequences of having children in bad situations and stuff. So in that sense, it is good. In another sense, it is bad because it allows for manipulation and creating creating deceptive techniques to pretend that someone is being given access to their genes in the next generation when that's not really true. And that goes for porn, OnlyFans, everything else, like every single deceptive and manipulative technique. It goes for increased like cheating and so on, and even in relationships, right? Like we are used to having men give resources to the children via the women, but now because there's no children, technically like it's asymmetric, and the women are basically capturing the resources without providing children, which it's basically hacking our evolutionary systems to do something that isn't what they were designed for, and some men will feel slighted by that. Of course, for other men, that's fantastic, and for other women, that's fantastic, and we can all rejoice in the fact that we can do that. So it really depends on how much do you want to put your genes in the next generation, whether you feel like that massive change was a good or a bad thing.